Good morning, everyone. My name's Aela Callan. Just on the tricky pronunciation of my name, I like to say it's Ella with a silent A. There might be a few dropouts because I am coming to you from northern Myanmar or Burma, which is where I'm making a documentary right now for Al Jazeera's 101 East program. And this is the program I formerly worked on digital strategy for, based out of Kuala Lumpur. I'll try and keep it short because if the connection sucks, there's nothing worse than listening to a bad line. And if it happens to work, then we've got some more time for questions, which is always good. I also apologise if you can hear the rather bad karaoke going on downstairs on the line. So from the outset, I'd like to say I'm no distribution expert. What I am is a filmmaker and a journalist who really wants people to watch my stuff. So I basically put a ton of effort into producing my films. And at the end of the day, I want people to see it, and a lot of people. But that's why I'm passionate about it, and that's how I make a difference. So I'm speaking in particular about distribution for long-form content. Everything that I create is 25 minutes or more. This is obviously, as we've said, not always ideal online, particularly on mobile. So I want to talk a bit about getting your audience to watch longer content. So let's go, if we can go to my first slide, please, helpers. How is long form content different? Well, in my experience working for television networks, the biggest difference with native online content is that we have this TV-shaped content. There's no need actually to have 25 minutes or 45 minutes for a show online. It's just that this has evolved to suit the ad breaks for television. So from the outset, I was kind of confronted by constraints on length, which is fixed. The other issue for my team was that we just dropped projects after we finished them, after we finished the edit basically, and moved on to the next. It didn't really occur to us to think about who was watching it and why. So all of our resources, and this is an incredible amount of resources in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of just sheer energy, went into creating the actual content, but nothing actually went into distribution. It was an afterthought. So I faced a lot of resistance early on from reporters who said, this isn't my job. Isn't there someone in the marketing department who can do this? So those were the challenges. If we can go on to the next slide. First thing I did was started to look into the data. So these are some old statistics. I'm probably not actually meant to share any of this, but things have drastically improved since these days. So hopefully none of my colleagues there care. This was actually for a film called Drugged Up Pakistan, which we ran on 101 East a few years ago. It was about heroin addiction in Pakistan. And you can see there the engagement curve, which is actually quite decent for a 25-minute piece, but you'll see from the 16,000 or so views that they had that day, most people watched about 11 minutes and only 5,000 people made it all the way to the end. So challenge number one is that the average engagement is always much shorter than the actual content. We can go to the next slide, please. For long-form content, mobile isn't necessarily king. So everyone told me, we had to be mobile first, and that's where the viewers are. But the data for that same program actually showed me that most people were watching on Windows desktop, which was super surprising to me. Like 16,000, I think there, and only 3,000 watched on mobile. But when I thought about it, it kind of stands to reason because people would settle in with dinner or they're going to bed or whatever, and they want to watch a longer piece on the computer or on a bigger screen. And so this was actually one of our program's strengths, which is that we have really great pictures for a documentary program. And so this is something that viewers naturally want to see on a bigger screen. So challenge number two was capturing the mobile audience and trying to drive them to watch this content on their high definition screens later. The next slide, please. So it didn't necessarily matter when the film was actually broadcast on television. This was kind of a big revolution in our thinking early on. You could sustain interest in some topics for a really long time and actually predict when you might get a spike in viewers. So here's one small example that was happening organically before we did any promotion, and it was around a film on the Indonesian president, Jokowi, before he was actually elected. So you can see over the year there's little spikes of interest that are happening during his campaign, when people wanted to know more about this guy who was running for president, and then when he was elected, and again when he was inaugurated. This is really different to a short news piece, which has relevance mostly for a much shorter period of time. So in my mind, challenge number 3 was finding those predictable points in time when the archive of really rich, great content that we already had would be relevant and valuable to our audience. I'll go on to the next slide, please. So interest is often location specific, and quite often it depends on location. So these are stats again, but from Facebook this time for the Drugged Up Pakistan film. People in the UK there were most interested, followed by Canada. Those 2 countries where we have a really high level of interest anyway. But you can see Pakistan, where the film was based, it was the 3rd, and India, probably because they like bad stories about Pakistan. And so this was showing me that, you know, the location of our audience wasn't just changing from, you know, depending on what, you know, where they were, but it actually changed based on every film that we did. So depending on the location that it was in, we could have a completely different audience. So my challenge number 4 was, how do we retain those Pakistani viewers that we were picking up for that episode, even if next week our show was broadcasting in Thailand? So on to the next slide. How did we end up getting more people to watch and for longer? Well, we went to the people who were already watching the whole thing. Remember those 5,000 viewers from Pakistan who made it all the way through, well, they weren't necessarily from Pakistan, but the 5,000 viewers who made it all the way to the end of Drugged Up Pakistan, that show. We obviously didn't go and interview all 5,000 of them, but we pulled out a couple of super viewers or super users who gave us some really interesting information about why they watched that program. When you think about it, the most successful media outlets online are differentiating themselves. They serve specific audiences rather than trying to serve everybody. That is to say, they know exactly who their audience is for each program. So we started creating for those super users and found that the audience grew from there. And also, these were people who we developed an ongoing relationship with. So it was more than people just clicking on something for a catchy headline, which they only watch 10 seconds of, and then they're invariably disappointed by the content. These were people who really actually were interested in what was happening in Pakistan or what was happening in the show that week. So if we go into my last slide, what did this actually mean in reality for our content creators? You know, all this information was very useful, but how did filmmakers like me, who are currently out in the field like I am now, use all this to grow a community? We call it audience mapping, and it's basically a guide that helps our producers prioritize their target audience for each episode. We do this before we go out into the field, which is always when you have much better ideas. It's before everything collapses into a heap and people in your film pull out and you have all these things to worry about. But it's also a good idea to start thinking about who your audience is before you go ahead and invest all this time and money and energy into creating the actual content. So it begins, you know, we basically have a brainstorming session, and these are the questions that we ask. Who would be interested in this story? So for the film I'm doing right now, it would be people like Myanmar watchers. It would be obviously people inside the country because, you know, this film is about a year since the government of Aung San Suu Kyi took power and we're giving a bit of a report card on how things are going. It will be refugees from Myanmar, migrant workers who are living in other countries who have left Myanmar, expats living in Asia, and then a couple of good ones that I thought our team came up with this time were like investors, which is, you know, an audience that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about creating for, but there's a lot of money coming into this country right now, so people want to know, how's the political situation? Is it going to be stable? So where are these groups physically and online is the next question that we ask. I will say sometimes, particularly in this region in Southeast Asia, we're not always creating for online. People have very low bandwidth. So sometimes we're actually, you know, physically going and putting on screenings in different countries, or we're having things translated, films translated into other languages and putting it on other platforms like Weibo for China. And so, you know, it can really vary. Here on this film that I'm doing right now, it's all about Facebook, because Facebook is absolutely king here in Myanmar. Everyone thinks it's actually the internet. They do search on it and all sorts of crazy things. So Facebook's a big part of what we're doing right now, but Viber is also really big. And I'm also really conscious in creating this film that we might have to do some shorter pieces for online, because 25 minutes is really hard to get people to watch with very low bandwidths on their phone. It costs them a lot of money to watch 25 minutes on their phone or on their computers, because connection hasn't traditionally been that great here. The next question that we ask is, why will they care? How would I get you guys sitting there in a room in Missouri to care about a country that maybe you know nothing at all about? Well, it could be that you've been here on holidays, or you might have been on holidays in neighboring Thailand and have looked on the map and seen Myanmar. Maybe there are people among you who have got relatives in Myanmar who have immigrated to the US, and so there's a historical or kind of family tie. There are a lot of different options. Maybe some of you have got a spare few million that you want to invest in startups here. That question tends to flow into the next one, which is how else we might engage our audience. So it could be sending advanced copies of a film to interest groups. It could be having a Twitter chat. It could be doing some radio. It could be, you know, waiting until there's some sort of timely news event happening here in Myanmar, like the by-elections that are coming up, and, you know, releasing the film then. Or, you know, using old content that we have and pushing it out again at the relevant time. The next and my favorite question is what else we can do with this story beyond a 25-minute piece. So I have a really great example from this week. I did a film last year about Chinese tourists running amok in Paris. And it's an old piece of content. One of the digital producers said, how about I chop this up into 3 parts or 4 parts and put shorter videos on Facebook? And the digital people all said, oh, that won't work. It's old content and people don't want to see a chopped up version of a film. Anyway, the first part of it has had 3 million views in the last 2 days. So I'm getting all these emails about my China film at the moment, and it started a whole lot of conversation among our audience, and even people who didn't see it when it ran the first time around. So that's one example. Today we were running around in a refugee camp, and, you know, we gave a phone to a little kid to go around and, you know, take some photos and film bits of what he was playing, marbles on the dirt and riding a bike around. And so that might make an interesting little Facebook video that makes people interested in the content. Why is that kid in the refugee camp? And, you know, what's the political situation that's led him to be there, and will he get out, for example. And the last one that we think about is the different opportunities during the production cycle to reach out to people. Right now, I'm in a kind of sensitive conflict area, and so I'm not broadcasting on social media where I am. But as soon as we get out of this area, you know, there might be an opportunity that, you know, I can start reaching out and saying, hey, I'm making this film. people tend to really love the sausage making of television. And so I've found some of my biggest hits have come from, me being in the edit suite and asking people what they think of stuff, or, showing this is how we set up the lights for an interview, and things like that, which has been surprising to me. But there are a lot of different opportunities, if you think outside the box, to reach your audience while you're actually making the content. So that's where I'll leave it. I don't know if I've gone over time or if we have any questions.
You're great. You have 4.5 minutes left. So questions for Ela. I have a question, because I'm supposed to, right? So what you're discussing is something that I try to say to my students is sort of building a tapestry of trust. You are leveraging different platforms in different ways to basically to drive audience. And it sounds like that works. Are you doing anything? You talked about sort of your influencers, your power users. What kind of relationship building are you doing with them? And if I missed it, I apologize. And also, do they help carry your message forth?
They do. So there are a few. I didn't reference it specifically, but quite a lot of the things that we do with our super users are reaching out to them while we're filming. If I know I've got an audience that have watched a lot of films that I've done in Malaysia, say, I will go to specific people even that I've interviewed and say, hey, what do you think about this story idea? Is this something you'd be interested in? And they write back yes or no, and then they feel very invested in it as I'm creating it. Quite often I actually give them advanced copies of what we're doing, and I don't even have to ask them really. I just email it to them and say, hey, you might be interested in this, it's coming up, or I send them the promo, and they will just share it themselves. So yeah, there is a really big, I haven't measured it specifically per se, but there is a big multiplier effect in that, because it stands to reason that, say, if you're someone who is interested in Myanmar, you're going to have friends who are interested in Myanmar. The other great multiplier for our films, and this doesn't always necessarily hold, but most of the time it does, is people who are in the film. They really want to promote it. And so you can kind of give it to them and they put it out to their circle and their circle and their circle. And that's another really good multiplier. The other thing that we really do is always respond on social media. So like our audience knows that, if they write something like great show or something, even if it takes a long time for us to get to it, we'll try and respond and say thanks for your feedback, or if there's a criticism, we'll engage, which I think is really important, that you're not just broadcasting all the time, that you're actually having an ongoing conversation, and that you think about releasing this piece of content, whether it be on television or on social media, as the beginning of the conversation on this topic, not as the end. I kind of like to assume that a lot of my viewers will have more information on this than I do. And so I ask them, basically, if this wasn't accurate, how would you describe it, or what would you have done? And quite often then that leads to the creation of more social media videos or ideas for other stories, for instance.
Ela, thank you so much. Oh, real quickly, Randy has a question, and since he's the boss.
Oh, I got 1 minute. Sorry. I'm wondering, so distribution, it sounds like that's kind of part of the process of figuring out the whole scope of the project. How many pieces have you done that way? And is that really from very beginning of the planning process inserted into every project you do?
Yes, it's absolutely essential in every project that I do. I've probably made more than 25 films for Al Jazeera and other networks. I probably a lot less, but I would have made a good 10 now that have that, and you can definitely see the difference in the amount of people that watch it, and the topics even that I pick. Being able to ask my little community, what they would be interested in, particularly women, we found out there was this whole, trove of stories that weren't being covered and that people wanted to see, and so that led to a big multiplication effect.
Ella, thank you so much. What time is it in northern Myanmar right now, just so we know?
It's just gone 9 p.m. So I'm going to collapse into bed. It's been a long day.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Bye.